Harlan Briggs did not notice the child at first. He was standing at the back of the Grand Meridian Ballroom with a small plate of food he had barely touched, counting the minutes until it was polite enough to leave, when the sound of the room changed. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way a fire goes quiet before it goes out, one conversation dropping, then another, then a third, until the silence moved across that enormous gilded space like something with weight and intention, and 300 of the wealthiest people in the state of Illinois all turned their heads in the same direction at the same moment. Harlan looked up from his plate. A child was walking. She had stepped away from her mother, away from the stage, away from the cluster of polished, important men who had spent the better part of the evening positioning themselves within arm's reach of her. She was 7 years old and small for her age, and she was walking in a single straight certain line across the entire length of that ballroom floor, her patent leather shoes making no sound at all on the marble, her face carrying an expression of such complete and quiet resolve that it silenced every conversation in the room as she passed through it. She walked past a man in a charcoal suit worth more than Harlan's truck. She walked past a silver-haired developer who had donated $400,000 to the Children's Hospital Fund that evening, and was used to rooms going quiet for him and not the other way around. She walked past 3 men in a row who had each spent months angling for exactly this child's attention in exactly this room, performing loudly and generously and warmly for her benefit whenever her mother was watching, and she walked past every single one of them without so much as a glance sideways. The room watched her. Harlan watched the room, watching her. It took him an embarrassingly long time to understand that she was walking toward him. He actually turned and looked behind himself, back toward the service doors and the rack of dirty glasses waiting to be cleared, because whoever that child was heading for with that kind of certainty, it could not possibly be him. There was no one behind him, just the doors and the glasses and the pale yellow light coming under the kitchen entrance, and Harlan Briggs in his rented suit standing at the very back of a room he had no real business being in. The child stopped directly in front of him. She looked all the way up, and then she reached up and took his hand. Not reached toward, not moved closer. Took it, both small fingers wrapping around 2 of his, holding on with the kind of grip that is not asking for anything, because it already knows. And then she spoke. She said, "You always slowed down for the dog on Maple Street." 7 words, plain and specific, and entirely true. The room was completely silent. Harlan looked past the child and found her mother standing just a few feet away, a woman he had never once spoken to in his life, though he had seen her from a distance at school pickup twice, standing a little apart from everyone else in a dark coat with her arms folded across herself. That same woman was standing now in the middle of 300 people with both hands pressed flat over her mouth and tears running openly and freely down her face, and she was not trying to stop them, and she did not seem to care at all who was watching, because she was hearing her daughter's voice, out loud, in public, for the first time since the morning her husband died. Someone near the stage, a man with a warm voice and good intentions, and absolutely no sense of timing, laughed and said, "Well, looks like somebody made their choice." The laughter that followed was warm and genuine and completely devastating. 300 faces turned slowly toward Harlan, like a single enormous creature finding its focus. And Harlan Briggs, standing at the back of that room in a suit that did not fit him perfectly, holding a plate of food he had not wanted, understood in one cold and clarifying instant exactly what just happened and exactly what everyone in that room expected him to do with it. And what he did in the 30 seconds after that was the one single thing that not one person in that room saw coming, least of all the child's mother. But before that gets told, there is something important to understand first. Because to understand why that child crossed an entire room full of the most powerful people in the state of Illinois to find one particular man standing at the back near the service doors, you first have to understand what 18 months of ordinary mornings looks like from the inside. And you have to understand the one small thing Harlan did every single day that nobody else in that child's life thought to do. And that starts a long way back from any ballroom. Harlan Briggs was 43 years old, and he drove a school bus for the Claremont Heights Unified School District, and he had been doing it for 11 years. His route was Route 14, which ran from the corner of Delancey and 5th all the way out along the back roads past Shepherd's Farm and Millbrook Park, and the long stretch of old residential streets that backed up against the reservoir, and he knew every bump in that road the way a person knows the particular creaks of their own house at night. He knew which stretches to slow for, and which lights were timed poorly, and which 3 driveways belonged to parents who were chronically late, and would wave frantically from the porch if he could just give them 45 more seconds. He got up every morning at 5:15, not because the route required it, but because those were the 45 minutes of the day that belonged entirely to him before anything else got its hands on them. He made coffee in the old percolator his mother had left him, the one with the chipped handle that he had never replaced because there was nothing wrong with it, and he stood at the kitchen window and drank in the dark while the neighborhood was still and quiet and entirely his. In the summer there were birds. In the winter there was just the dark and the coffee and the particular quality of silence that belongs to a house before anyone else wakes up. His daughter's name was June. She was 9 years old, and she had her mother's hair, which was very dark and very straight, and she had Harlan's eyes, which were a pale, unremarkable gray and saw everything. She split her weeks between Harlan's house and her mother's apartment across town, which was an arrangement that had taken 2 years and one very patient mediator to settle, and that worked reasonably well now most of the time, which Harlan understood to be about as good as that kind of arrangement ever got. On the weeks June was with him, she woke up at 6:45 and padded out to the kitchen in her socks and her old green sweatshirt, and she always wanted oatmeal with exactly 2 spoonfuls of brown sugar, and she always sat at the same chair at the small kitchen table, and she always had something to tell him, something she had been saving up since the night before, some fact about an animal or a book or an injustice she had observed at school that required immediate discussion. Harlan always listened. He always had time for it. Whatever was on that small, serious face when she came out to the kitchen in the morning, he had time for it. On the weeks she was not with him, the mornings were quieter in a way that was not entirely comfortable. He still got up at 5:15. He still made the coffee. He still stood at the window. But the house had a different quality on those mornings, a held-breath quality. And Harlan had learned not to push against it, but just to let it be what it was and to be grateful for the weeks he did have. He had been a single parent for 4 years. He was not bitter about his marriage ending because he had been in it long enough to understand that 2 people can be decent people and fundamentally incompatible, and that staying out of obligation does damage to everyone in the house, including the child. He was not bitter about his work either, which some people seem to expect, as if driving a school bus were a consolation prize rather than a choice. He had tried other things. He had worked in logistics for 3 years after college, sitting in front of a computer in a beige building moving numbers around, and he had been quietly miserable in a way that he could not entirely explain to anyone who had not felt it. The bus driving had come to him almost by accident, a temporary job that became a permanent one, and he had discovered something in himself that he had not known was there before. He was genuinely good at being present. He was genuinely good at noticing. After 11 years on Route 14, Harlan Briggs could read a child's entire morning in the first 3 seconds of contact. He could read it in the way they climbed the steps, in the way of the backpack, and whether it was hitting one's shoulder or both, in the set of the jaw and the quality of the eyes, and whether the goodbye at the door had been warm or complicated, the ones who had not slept, the ones who had not eaten, the ones who had overheard something the night before that they were still carrying, something grown up and jagged that did not belong inside a small body, but had gotten there anyway. He noticed these things with the same casual precision that a good carpenter notices whether a floor is level. It was not a performance of sensitivity. It was just a skill he had developed because he had spent 11 years paying attention, and most people, if they are honest about it, do not pay that much attention to children in the daily run of things. Most people look at a child and see whether the child is fine or not fine, and if the child appears basically fine, they move on. Harlan looked at a child and saw everything that basic fine was sitting on top of. He did not say anything about most of what he saw. That was the other part of it. He noticed, and he held it quietly, and he adjusted accordingly. If a kid climbed on heavy-shouldered, he did not ask what was wrong. He just knew. He just made the morning a little bit easier in whatever small way he could. A slower route of the traffic allowed it. A particular song on the radio. The knowledge that somebody in the world had seen them today before they had to walk into everything the day was going to ask of them. Most people never bother to look. That is the whole story. Everything else is details. Her name was Rosie Calloway. She was 6 years old when she first appeared on Route 14, and Harlan noticed her on the very first morning, not because she did anything to draw attention, but because of the precise opposite of that. She climbed onto the bus at the Maple Street stop, and she found a seat in the second row from the front, and she sat down, and she did not look at anyone, not at the other children, not at Harlan, not at anything inside the bus at all. She looked out the window the whole way to school with an expression that was not sad, exactly, and was not angry, exactly, and was not any single thing he could put a simple name to. It was more like a face that had decided to go somewhere else entirely, while the body dealt with the business of getting through the day. She was small. She had dark blonde hair that was always neatly done, 2 braids or a ponytail depending on the morning, which told Harlan that whoever was getting her ready in the morning was paying careful attention to the visible things. She had a backpack with a rabbit on it, faded from washing, and she held the straps with both hands the whole ride, not white-knuckling it, just holding on the way you hold on to something familiar when everything else is uncertain. She did not speak, not to the other children, who after a few attempts at friendly overtures gave up and left her alone in the way children eventually do with someone who does not respond to them. Not to Harlan, not to anyone on that bus, ever. In the first 3 months of the school year, he learned her story the way he learned most things about the children on his route. Sideways, in pieces, from the other adults in the orbit, never told directly. The district administrator, who processed her file, the aide who rode the bus on Tuesdays and mentioned it in an offhand way one afternoon, the parent of one of the other Maple Street kids, who caught him one morning and said in a lowered voice, "That little one lost her father last spring. Accident on the highway outside Joliet." She was 5. She did not add anything after that, because there was nothing to add. In November, during the 3rd week of the month on a Tuesday morning, Rosie climbed onto the bus and she paused at the front, which she never did. She always went straight to her seat, and she held out something toward Harlan, a piece of paper, folded into a very small and precise square, folded several times over, the way a child folds something they thought about a great deal. She held it out without looking at him. Her eyes were focused somewhere around the middle of his chest, and her arm was extended as far as it would go, as if she needed maximum possible distance between herself and this transaction. Harlan took it. He did not unfold it right there. He said, "Thank you, Rosie," and he put it in his chest pocket, and he did not look at it while she was on the bus. She went to her seat. She looked out the window. He drove the route. He unfolded it in the parking lot after the last drop-off with the engine idling and the lot empty around him. It was a drawing in pencil and some color marker of a bus on a road with a dog sitting on a corner watching the bus go past. And the dog had been drawn with great care, and the bus had a driver in it, and the driver had a hat on and was waving one hand. That was it. No writing. No signature. Just that. Harlan sat in the empty parking lot for a while with the drawing open on the steering wheel. He did not feel the way a person feels when they have accomplished something. He felt the way a person feels when they have been trusted with something very small and very breakable and very important. He folded the drawing back carefully along its original creases, and he put it in the glove compartment of the bus. He kept it there for the rest of the year. December brought a small nod, not at him directly, but at the corner, at the dog, a tiny tilt of the chin as the bus slowed, like an acknowledgement between herself and the dog that the bus had fulfilled its obligation of slowing down again today. Harlan saw it and said nothing and felt something warm and private in his chest. In January, she saved him a seat. She had been sitting in the second row from the front since September. In January, she moved 1 row further back to the 3rd row, which was Harlan's peripheral sight line in the mirror, and there was always a gap next to her where no other child sat, which the other children seemed to understand without being told. It was a small thing. It meant nothing to anyone else on that bus. It meant something to Harlan. By February, her posture on the bus was different. She still looked out the window. She still said nothing. But she no longer held on to the backpack straps, and the brace held in quality had relaxed by some measurable degree, not gone, not resolved, but loosened the way a knot loosens when someone has been working at it patiently from one direction for a long time. She still did not speak. But she was not all the way inside herself the way she had been in October. She was a little bit here. Harlan had come to love that child in the way a person loves something they have been quietly paying attention to for long enough that the knowing of it has become part of the architecture of their daily life. It had nothing to do with her mother and nothing to do with money, which at this point he did not know she had in any extraordinary quantity, and nothing to do with anything except the simple fact that he had shown up the same way every single morning since September, and Rosie Calloway had slowly, in her own time and entirely on her own terms, begun to let him be one of the people in the world she could count on. He did not confuse that for something it was not. He was her bus driver. She was a child on his route. Those were the true and fixed dimensions of the thing. He honored those dimensions because they mattered, and because the trust of a grieving child is a particular and irreplaceable kind of trust, and he would not muddy it with anything else. But he loved her in the way that you love the things you show up for long enough to actually know. Now, the child's mother. Her name was Claire Calloway, and she was 36 years old, and she was, depending on how you arrange the facts, one of the wealthiest private individuals in the state of Illinois. David Calloway had built his fortune in logistics software, which was an unglamorous thing to be extraordinarily rich from, but had the advantage of being real and durable. And when he died at 34, he left behind a company worth north of $800 million, a house in Lincoln Park that had been photographed for architectural magazines, and a wife who had loved him with her whole heart, and who found herself standing in the wreckage of that life with a 5-year-old daughter who had stopped speaking in a grief that she had absolutely no idea what to do with. Claire had grown up in a small town in western Ohio, the daughter of a pharmacist and a school librarian, which was how she was raised and how she thought herself even now, regardless of what was in the accounts. She had met David in college, and she had loved him before she knew what his family had, and she had gone on loving him through 15 years of building something together, and she had been, in the true and honest sense of the word, happy, not performing happy, actually happy, in the ordinary daily way of two people who like each other, and have built something together that is genuinely good. The grief after he died was not a performance either. It was a specific catastrophic grief of someone who has had the floor removed from a life they were genuinely living, and Claire moved through the first year of the way a person moves through deep water, slowly with great effort, getting through each day by concentrating entirely on the next necessary thing. She had people around her, family and friends, and a very competent estate manager, and a therapist she saw twice a week. But the loneliness of it was a thing that none of those presences could actually touch, because the loneliness was not the absence of people. It was the absence of the specific person who had known her all the way through, who had been the other leg of the table, who had made sense of her to herself. She knew Rosie was struggling. She knew in a way only a mother who is also struggling knows it, which is to say with complete and unsparing clarity and absolutely no idea what to do about it. She tried everything the specialists recommended. She tried warmth, and she tried structure, and she tried routine, and she tried giving space, and she tried reducing pressure, and she tried everything that anyone who loved her daughter suggested, and Rosie stared out windows and held on to her backpack straps and did not speak in full sentences to another living soul for 18 months. And then there were the men. The men had begun to appear approximately 8 months after David's death, which was, in hindsight, an extraordinary commentary on the patience of the ambitious. They were wealthy and polished, and some of them were genuinely not bad people in the abstract, which made the whole thing more complicated, and not less. They came at Claire's grief with something that looked from a distance like kindness, and felt up close like acquisition. They brought Rosie expensive things she had no interest in, stuffed animals and tablets, and a brand-new bicycle that sat in the garage untouched, and they ruffled her hair and crouched her level and said things like "there she is" and "how's my girl" in loud, warm voices, whenever Claire was within earshot, and they were completely and entirely different people the moment Claire left a room. Not cruel, not harsh, just gone. Rosie stopped existing for them the moment she stopped being useful as a demonstration of warmth and fatherly potential. Rosie saw every single bit of it. Children know. They always know. They are the finest and most unforgiving lie detectors that have ever existed on this earth. They can smell a performance from across a room, and they never forget who is real and who is only acting, and they file this information quietly, and they never forget it. And they do not give second chances, because they do not need to, because the first impression is always the true one, and the later performances are the lie. Rosie had decided, without words, without confrontation, with the complete and irrefutable finality of a child who has had her trust broken enough times to know what broken trust feels like, that none of these men were real. And she was right. And Claire, who was watching, understood it. She was watching her daughter correctly assess every man who came near them and reject every one of them, and it was simultaneously the most heartbreaking thing she had ever witnessed, and the thing she was most grateful for, because her daughter's instincts were perfect and she trusted them. It came to a head at the Meridian Foundation Gala the previous November, 18 months after David died. Claire had been cornered near the bar by a man named Preston Hartley, who was very good-looking and very charming and very interested in the logistics software company in a way that he was not quite skilled enough at hiding, and she had stood there listening to him talk, and she had felt something inside her that was not grief and was not loneliness, but was something colder and more resolved than either of those things. She had looked at him and she had thought, no, and then she had thought, I need a door that no one can open. I need something that protects not just me, but Rosie. I need this to stop. She had stepped away from Preston Hartley, and she had walked to the edge of the room, and she had found the nearest cluster of people she trusted, which included 2 board members and 1 family friend. And she had said something that she later understood had been very unwise from a public relations standpoint and very wise from every other standpoint. She had said, loudly enough for the surrounding area of the room to hear her clearly, that she would not consider remarrying under any circumstances unless it was a man that Rosie chose for herself, her daughter, who had not spoken to a stranger in over a year, who had not shown warmth to a single adult outside of their immediate family since her father died. The people who heard it understood immediately what she was saying. They understood that it was not a romantic declaration, but a locked door. They understood that Rosie Calloway choosing a man was approximately as likely as the moon going dark on a Tuesday. It was a declaration of permanent unavailability wrapped in the language of hope. And it was elegant, and it was real, and it was exactly what she meant. Word spread, the way things spread in rooms like that. And by the end of the evening, everyone in Claire Calloway's social orbit understood that she had made a public vow, and the nature of that vow, and the nature of the child at the center of it. And the implications were perfectly clear to every single person who had been circling her. The key had been thrown into the sea. This was in November. And the following October, almost a full year later, was the annual Meridian Foundation Gala, which was where Harlan Briggs, who knew none of this, found himself standing at the back of a room near the service doors with a plate of food he did not want. He had not intended to go. The invitation came through the district's community liaison, a cheerful woman named Denise who coordinated between the school district and the various civic organizations it partnered with, and she had appeared in the bus yard on a Wednesday afternoon in September with a small stack of envelopes and the specific energy of someone who has an obligation to appear enthusiastic about something. The Meridian Foundation, she explained, donated significantly to the district's after-school programs, and as part of that partnership, they extended a number of event invitations to district staff each year. It was a nice evening, she said. Open bar, good food. A chance to see where some of the district's funding came from. She said it in a way that suggested attendance was noted and appreciated. Harlan took the envelope and put it on his kitchen counter and did not think about it for 3 weeks. His neighbor, Pat Shea, who was 58 and had been divorced for a decade and was a person of very strong opinions about social obligation, saw the envelope on the counter during a Sunday visit and picked it up and said, "You should go to this." Harlan said he probably wouldn't. Pat said he should. "It's one evening," she said. "It costs you nothing. Get out of this house." Getting out of the house required arranging for June, who was with him that week, to stay at his sister's for the night, which his sister Marcy said was completely fine, and she was glad to have her, which Harlan already knew, because Marcy always meant it when she said it. It required finding something to wear that was not a uniform, which turned out to be more complicated than it should have been, and resulted in a rented suit jacket from a place on Madison Street that fit him in the shoulders but not quite in the length of the sleeves. It required driving 40 minutes into the city on a Thursday evening, when he would considerably rather have been on his couch. He went because Pat was right that it cost him nothing, and because Denise had made it sound like it genuinely mattered to the district, and because he was, at his core, a person who showed up when showing up was the right thing to do. He arrived at the Grand Meridian at 6:45, 15 minutes after the official start time, which he understood to be the correct window for someone in his position. He handed over his invitation at the door and received a name tag that he stuck to the lapel of the rented jacket, and he walked into the ballroom and took stock of it. It was the largest ballroom he had ever been inside. The ceiling was 40 feet high, and the lighting was warm and indirect, and designed by someone who understood that the right light makes everyone look like a slightly better version of themselves. The tables were dressed in white linen, and the floral arrangements were the kind that cost more than Harlan's monthly grocery bill. The people moving through the space were dressed in a way that only looks effortless when it costs a significant amount of money, which is to say that everything fit and everything was the right color, and everything coordinated in a way that looked casual, but was not. Harlan got a glass of water from a passing tray and moved to the perimeter of the room. He was not uncomfortable in the way someone who feels inferior might be uncomfortable. He was uncomfortable in the way someone who knows they are in the wrong room feels uncomfortable, which is different and less personal. He had nothing against these people. He had no particular resentment of their money or their clothes or the easy way they moved through this space that had been built for them. He just did not belong in it, and he knew it, and they would know it if they looked, and the smartest thing to do was to stay near the walls and eat something and leave at the first polite opportunity. He found his way to the far back of the room, past the last clustered tables, past the edge of the dancing area that had not yet been activated, all the way to the wall near the double doors that led back to the kitchen service area. There was a long table against this wall with a tray of canapes that a young woman in a black apron had deposited there at some point and forgotten about. Harlan took a small plate and put 3 things on it and stood there and watched the room from as far back as he could reasonably get. He did not know the biggest donor of the evening. He did not know anyone in this room. He had no idea that a woman named Claire Calloway was sitting at the head table near the stage, or that she had a daughter who rode Route 14, or that there was a public vow that her name was attached to, or any of the rest of it. He was a man at the back of a room he'd been told he should attend, counting very quietly toward the moment he could leave. He was watching the table linens and thinking about nothing much when the sound changed. It happened in a wave. The nearest conversations dropped first, then the next, like a sound moving through water, and Harlan looked up because that kind of silence has a specific texture to it, a collective hell-breath quality, and it is not the silence of something bad happening, but the silence of something unexpected happening, which are 2 entirely different silences, and a person learns to tell them apart. He looked up, and he saw Rosie Calloway. He did not know, in that first second, that it was Rosie Calloway. He saw a small child in a dark blue dress with 2 braids, which was familiar, and he registered that the child had stepped away from a head table near the stage and was walking across the room with the absolute undivided focus of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has decided to get there. But the room was large and the light was warm and the distance was considerable, and for the first several seconds he saw only a child and a room going quiet around her. He saw her walk past a man in a charcoal suit. He saw her walk past the silver-haired man near the second pillar, who received her passage with an expression of benevolent expectation. As if whatever she was doing, she was certainly coming toward him. She walked past him without a glance. She walked past 3 more men in a row, and she walked past them all without slowing and without looking, and the room's silence deepened, and Harlan was watching this with something that was not yet recognition, but was beginning to be something. He saw her braids. He saw the rabbit backpack. He turned to look behind himself, back toward the service doors, because there was nothing back here except the doors and the tray of canapes and the pale light from the kitchen. There was no one back there, just the doors and the industrial quiet behind them, and Harlan. Rosie Calloway stopped in front of him. She looked all the way up at his face with her gray eyes, which she had gotten from her father, which Harlan did not know, which were the exact pale gray of Lake Michigan on a winter morning. And her expression was the most completely resolved expression he had ever seen on a child's face. Not triumphant, not nervous, entirely certain. She had made up her mind about this somewhere between the head table and the back wall, and it was made all the way up, and the room could do whatever room wanted to do about that. She reached up and took his hand, and she said, "You always slow down for the dog on Maple Street." 7 words. The silence of the room after those 7 words was the silence that follows something irreversible. Harlan stood there with his child's hand in his, and the room packed full of powerful people watching, and he heard it clearly the way he heard it, that she was not speaking to the room. She was not performing for the room. She was not saying something she had rehearsed. She was saying to him, and only to him, the one specific and entirely true thing that had made him different from every other person in the daily run of her life. The one thing she had been holding and examining and filing carefully away for months. The one thing she knew with absolute certainty was real. You always slowed down for the dog on Maple Street. He was still processing this, still standing there with the enormous stillness of the room pressing in on all sides, when he looked past Rosie and found her mother. Claire Calloway was standing perhaps 8 feet away, and she was not looking at Harlan. She was looking at her daughter. She was looking at her daughter with both hands pressed completely flat over her mouth, and her eyes were fully open and completely streaming. And she was not trying to stop the tears, and she was not making any sound, and she did not seem to be aware of anyone or anything in that room except a 7-year-old child standing with her hand in the hand of a man she didn't know and speaking out loud in a room full of people for the first time in 18 months. Harlan understood in that moment that the mother's tears had nothing to do with him. They had nothing to do with the vow, which he did not know about yet. They had to do with her daughter's voice. The fact of it, present and audible and real, in a room full of people. The sound of her daughter's voice after a year and a half of silence. That was what was breaking Claire Calloway open in the middle of 300 people who were all watching her do it. Then the man near the stage said it. Well, looks like somebody made their choice. The laughter was immediate and genuine and came from a warm and delighted place, and it was, in its timing, completely devastating, because it instantly converted a private and sacred moment between a child and a bus driver into a public spectacle with a narrative already attached to it. The laughter moved through the room, and the 300 faces turned toward the back wall and toward Harlan, and the weight of their collective attention was something he felt physically, like a change in the air pressure. He understood what had happened now. He saw the vow on the faces of the people nearest to him, in the way they were looking at him, which was the way people look at someone who has just accidentally won something very large. He saw the story they were already telling themselves. The ordinary man, the rich widow, the silent child's impossible choice made real, the whole improbable arc of it landing perfectly in the back of the ballroom. He saw every social mechanic in that room activating at once. And he understood, with the cold clarity of someone who has spent 11 years reading people before the world gets to them, exactly what every single person in that room expected him to do. He let go of Rosie's hand. Very gently. He did not pull it away. He simply opened his fingers slowly and let her hand come free, and then he lowered himself all the way down until he was on one knee on the marble floor of the Grand Meridian Ballroom in his rented suit at exact eye level with Rosie Calloway. And he turned his back on the room, not dramatically, not as a statement, simply as a practical fact. He turned his back on everything behind him, and he turned his whole face toward this child. And for the next 30 seconds the room did not exist. There was only Rosie, standing in her dark blue dress with her braids and her steady gray eyes, and Harlan on one knee in front of her, and the small private world that the two of them had been quietly building since September the previous year. He said to her, quietly, just for her, "What you just did is the bravest thing I have ever seen any person do." He said, "Thank you for calling me your friend, because that is exactly what I am. I am your friend. And I am always going to be your friend." He looked at her. She looked at him. She was not crying. She was entirely still and entirely present. The most present she had ever been in all the months he had known her, not looking past him or out a window or somewhere else, looking directly at him. And he saw in her face a specific, particular expression of a child who has been seen, truly seen, not assessed, not measured, not worried over. Seen. He stood up. He turned to face the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The room was still and attentive, and he was a man who was used to being heard when he spoke in a quiet space, which is a particular skill that belongs to people who are used to being responsible for the safety of small children in a moving vehicle. And I've learned that a steady voice carries farther than a loud one. He said, "This child did not choose a husband tonight. She chose a friend for herself. That is all she did. It is a pure and beautiful thing, and I will not stand here and let it be twisted into something else in front of her." He let that sit in the room for one full second. Then he turned back to Rosie and he said, "I will see you Monday morning, and I will slow down for the dog." And Rosie Calloway, who had not smiled at an adult who was not her mother in 18 months, looked at him with those gray eyes, and the very edge of something appeared at one corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile yet, but a beginning of the country that a smile lives in, and Harlan saw it, and it was enough. He picked up his jacket from where he had draped it over the corner of the serving table. He put it on. He said, "Thank you to nobody in particular," which is a thing a person says when they are taking their leave of a room they are not going to miss. And he walked toward the side doors and threw them and out into the cool October night. And he got in his truck, and he drove home to the house where his sister was staying with June, and he let himself in quietly so as not to wake anybody. And he sat in the kitchen for a long while in the dark with his hands around an empty coffee mug, looking at nothing. He did not feel like he had done something noble. He felt like he had done the only possible thing. He felt, underneath that, the specific and complicated feeling of a person who has just had something offered to them that they wanted and had to refuse, not because the one was wrong, but because the moment was wrong, because the timing was wrong, because the manner of the offering was wrong, because a woman's grief and a child's trust in a room full of laughing spectators is not the correct context for any genuine beginning. And he felt, underneath even that, a small, warm, private thing that was not grief and was not longing and was not anything dramatic. Just the knowledge that Rosie Calloway had crossed an entire room to find him and that she had said his words back to him and that she had called him a friend. He sat with that for a long while. Then he went to bed. He drove Route 14 on Monday morning. He slowed down at the Maple Street corner. The dog was sitting in its usual spot, sandy and philosophical, watching the bus with its customary expression of complete equanimity. Harlan slowed down. He looked in the mirror. In the second row from the front, Rosie Calloway was sitting with her face turned to the window. She was watching the dog, and as the bus passed at the correct slow speed, she lifted one hand from the backpack straps, and she gave the dog a small wave. It was the first time she had waved at anything from the window of that bus. Harlan put the bus back to regular speed and drove her out, and said nothing and felt the small warm thing in his chest that he had been carrying since Thursday night expand by one careful degree. 3 days after the gala, on a Tuesday afternoon, he pulled the bus in the yard after the last run and went through the routine of locking up. And when he came out of the yard office, he found a woman standing on the sidewalk outside the fence. She was wearing dark jeans and a plain gray coat and flat shoes, which he would later understand was a very deliberate choice on her part, and her hair was down, which was different from the 2 occasions he had seen her from a distance at school drop-off. And she was standing with her hands in her pockets, and there was no car visible nearby, and no driver, and no phone in her hand, and no indication of anything except a person who had decided to come somewhere and was here. He recognized her. He stood at the gate for a moment, just looking at her, because the sight of her was slightly disorienting in a way that it is always slightly disorienting to see a person you know slightly in a completely unexpected context. He opened the gate and stepped through. She said, "I'm Claire Calloway." He said he knew. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I came to say something, and I don't want to do it at a school event or anywhere that has a lot of people watching." He waited. She said, "I watched every man in that room do the calculation in about 2 seconds. And then I watched you turn your back on the room and kneel down to be at her eye level. And the thing I can't stop thinking about is that you weren't doing it for me to see. You turned your back on the room. I had to come around sideways to even see your face. You weren't performing for anybody. You were just talking to my daughter." She stopped for a moment. Her hands were still in her coat pockets, and she was not looking away from him. She said, "You are the first adult in 2 years who looked at that child and did not immediately see a way to use her to get to me. And I don't know exactly what to do with that yet. But I know it's true, and I felt like someone needed to say it out loud to you." Harlan stood on the sidewalk outside the bus yard with his hands at his sides, and he looked at this woman who had been through 18 months of grief and siege and exhaustion, and he felt a particular sensation of being accurately seen by someone, which is not a common experience and is not a small one. He said, "She's been carrying something too heavy for a long time." Claire said, "I know. I've watched it every morning for a year and a half, and I haven't been able to lift 1 ounce of it off her." A pause. Harlan said, "She waved at the dog this morning." And Claire Calloway, who had composed herself extremely well for this whole conversation, pressed her lips together for 1 second and looked briefly at the sidewalk, and then looked back up and said, "The one on the corner of Maple and the Reservoir Road?" He said yes. She said, "She told me about that dog in October last year, It was the first full sentence she said to me in 3 months. She called it the Monday dog. They stood there for a moment in the afternoon, quiet outside the bus yard, with a particular quality of air that belongs to late October, when the light goes flat and golden, and the year is tilting toward its end. Then they started talking, the way two ordinary people talk when there is nothing left to perform and no one watching and no audience to manage. They talked about Rosie and about June and about the specific weight of being a single parent, which is a weight that looks from the outside like a logistical challenge and feels from inside like a fundamental restructuring of everything you thought you were. Claire talked about David, not about the death, not yet, but about the years before, what their life had looked like, the specific ordinary goodness of it that she was still in the process of understanding was gone. Harlan talked about his marriage, and about Marcy, who was his sister and his closest friend, and about June and the oatmeal and the 2 spoonfuls of brown sugar and the animal facts. Claire laughed at the animal facts. It was a real laugh, not a social laugh, and it changed her face entirely. They did not discuss the vow. Not once. The whole conversation, and not once. Neither of them mentioned it, and neither of them needed to, because the vow was not the point. It had never been the point. The point was a child who had stopped speaking and had just this week waved at a dog and had crossed a room full of the most powerful people in Illinois to take the hand of a bus driver. And whatever grew out of that fact, if anything did, would grow on its own terms at its own speed. And neither of them was going to try to force it or rush it or make it into something it was not ready to be. He did not ask for her number. She did not offer it. What she did, before she left, was say, she mentioned the Monday dog again this morning. She said she thinks it knows you. Harlan stood on the sidewalk and felt that land. He said, the dog might be right. Claire looked at him for a moment with an expression. He didn't have a name for yet, and then she put her hands back in her pockets, and she said she would see him around. And she walked away up the block and around the corner and was gone. Harlan stood there for a minute. Then he went home. What followed was not a courtship in the conventional sense. It did not have that shape. What it had was this. 2 people who had found their way into proximity through a child, who were both excessively careful about that child, who were both excessively careful about themselves for reasons that had nothing to do with each other and everything to do with what they had each already lived through, circling towards something at a speed that was not romantic frustration, but was instead the appropriate and considered pace of 2 people who understood what was at stake. Harlan held back for months. He was clear with himself about why, and it was not pride, and it was not strategy. It was Rosie. Rosie's heart had been broken once by something she had no say in and no protection against. She was a child. She had no capacity to manage the specific and terrible grief of losing someone she had come to count on, and she had demonstrated that with 18 months of silence, and Harlan would not, under any circumstances that he could control, become someone she counted on and then lose. He would not allow anything to develop between himself and Claire at a pace that brought Rosie into it before it was solid, before he knew, before both of them knew completely that this was real. So he drove Route 14. He said, "Good morning," Rosie every morning. He slowed down at the corner on Maple Street, where the dog sat. He drove the route. And over the month of autumn and winter and then spring, Rosie Calloway changed on that bus in ways that were so gradual, they were almost invisible from one day to the next, but were, across a span of months, enormous. In November, she spoke to another child on the bus. 3 sentences, directed at a girl named Audrey who sat 2 rows back, regarding the specific aerodynamic properties of a paper airplane that Audrey was attempting to fold incorrectly. Harlan heard every word. He looked straight ahead and drove the route. In December, she began saying good morning back. Not every morning, not with any predictability. But sometimes, on the step up into the bus, she would look at Harlan directly and say good morning in a voice that was a little rough with disuse, but was entirely her own, and Harlan would say good morning. Rosie back in exactly the same register, treating it as a completely ordinary thing it was, which was a correct response, and the only one that would allow her to keep doing it. By February, the dog on Maple Street had been introduced to a proper narrative, which Rosie delivered in installments over the course of several weeks, regarding its personality, its likely inner life, and its philosophical views on the passage of the school bus. The dog, whose actual name turned out to be Gerald, same as the owner, was, according to Rosie, a stoic. He did not chase things because he had transcended the need. He sat on the corner because the corner was his, which was a fact. Harlan received these reports with the gravity they deserved. By March, she was talking on the bus the way she had apparently talked before her father died, constantly, specifically about whatever was on her mind, not requiring agreement or response, simply sharing the content of her thinking with the available audience, which was Harlan, and occasionally the surrounding children who had grown accustomed to her and were, by this point, extremely fond of her. He watched all of this from the front seat with his hands on the wheel and something in his chest that he did not try to name, just let be what it was. And he kept driving. Claire, during these months, was watching something else. She was watching the way Rosie talked about Mondays, not just the bus, but the specific texture of her description of the bus, the way she talked about it as a place where something good happened every morning before school, a reliable small good thing that belonged to her. She watched the way Rosie, in February, started drawing again, which she had not done since before David died. The drawings were of the bus, the dog on the corner, a driver's hat, and a waving hand. She watched her daughter re-enter the world through a very specific and narrow door that had been built, one slow morning at a time, by a man driving the same route in the same direction, at the same time every day, without ever asking anything for it. And she was, without any particular drama or declaration, falling in love with him, not because he was humble. She would have seen through performed humility in about 45 seconds, and it would have disgusted her, not because he was working class or uncomplicated, or any of those things that a certain kind of story makes into symbols, not because of what he represented in contrast to the men who had been circling her, because of the specific way his face looked in the bus mirror when Rosie said something funny, because of the way he answered Rosie's question about the dog's philosophy with the same seriousness he would bring to any genuine question, which was to say completely, because of the conversation they had outside the bus yard in October and the ones that followed it at the school fair in November, where they had ended up standing next to each other at the pie table by accident and had stayed for 40 minutes. And the Sunday afternoon in January when Rosie had a school project, and Claire had called to ask what Harlan remembered about the Maple Street Corners geography, and they had talked for an hour and a half about nothing related to the project. She fell for him the way you fall for something real. Not all at once, not in a moment, but gradually and then completely, like a tide that comes in so slowly you don't realize the beach is gone until you're already standing in water up to your knees. On Harlan's side it was this. The money was a problem, not an attraction. He was aware of it the way you are aware of a very large piece of furniture in a small room, not because it is ugly, but because it changes the geometry of everything. He was aware that there was no version of a relationship with Claire Calloway that would not be a public and commented upon thing. He was aware that there were people who would look at it and see exactly the story the ballroom had started to tell in October, the lucky bus driver, the fortunate accident of a child's affection, the whole improbable arithmetic of it, and that he could never control what those people believed, and that the not controlling of it would require a particular quality of self-possession that he was not certain he had enough of. But those were, in the end, problems of scale and not problems of kind. The real question, the one he kept turning over in the long, quiet mornings with his coffee in the dark window, was the one about Rosie. The one about whether he was genuinely the right person for this specific child and this specific family, or whether the feeling of connection he had with Rosie was a particular kind of mirror, showing him back to himself in a flattering light that might not hold up to fuller examination. He turned that question over honestly for months, and what he kept arriving at every time was this. He did not need Rosie to be healed. He had not come to her as a therapeutic project or a responsibility or a problem. He had come to her simply as another person on the bus who was going through a hard morning, and she had come to him slowly and entirely on her own terms, and the connection that had built between them was not his achievement, and was not credential. It was a relationship. It was a genuine and specific relationship between two people who had been paying attention to each other, and it was real, and it was not going anywhere. He understood. The night that June came home from her mother's with a drawing she had made at school, a drawing that she slid across the kitchen table to him with great ceremony, of a bus and a dog on a corner and two stick figures at the bus door, and he asked who the two people were, and June said the tall one is you and the short one is your friend Rosie. He understood then, looking at his daughter's drawing, that the question had been answered, that the answer had been arriving gradually for months, and he had simply not been paying attention to the moment it completed. He called Claire that evening, not to say any of it. He was not there yet, and he knew it, and he wasn't pretending otherwise. He called to tell her that Rosie had described the dog's philosophy as stoic this week, and had explained that his transcendence of the need to chase things was what distinguished him from lesser dogs. Claire laughed, and then went quiet for a moment, and then said something about it being a very good description of a particular kind of peace that she would like to have more of in her own life, and her voice when she said it had a quality that was not quite a question, but was not a question either. And Harlan said, "I think you've earned it." And there was a pause on the line, a pause of the kind that is not silence, but is instead two people both registering the same thing at the same moment, and both deciding not to look directly at it yet, which is sometimes the most honest available response. And then they talked for another hour about something else. He asked her in April, not in a production, not in a setting with any witnesses. He picked up June from Marcy's on a Saturday morning, and then drove to Claire's house, which was in Lincoln Park, and which he had been to, by that point, perhaps 8 or 9 times, and which he had made peace with in the way a person makes peace with something that is simply true about the person they care about. He parked the truck on the street, and he went to the door, and Rosie answered it, which she always did because she had a strong opinion about doors. And she said, "Hi, June," to his daughter, and the two of them disappeared into the house with the immediate, purposeful energy of two children who have a project in progress. Claire came to the doorway. She was in her Saturday clothes, which he knew well by now. Old jeans and a soft sweater, hair not completely arranged yet, coffee in a mug in her hand. She looked like herself. She looked like the realest version of herself that he had access to, which was a version that only appeared on ordinary weekend mornings when there was nothing to manage and no one to perform for. He said, "I am not going to make a thing out of this." She said, "Okay." He said, "I want to see where this goes. I want to do it slowly, and I want to do it right. And I want Rosie to be okay the whole time, and June to be okay the whole time. And I want to not make it into something it isn't yet. But I want to move toward it. If you do." She looked at him over her coffee mug with those eyes that he had spent 6 months learning to read, and that he was still learning. She said, "I have been moving toward it since October." He said, "I know. I was just moving slower." She said, "I noticed." He said, "I had reasons." She said, "I know what your reasons were." He said, "Were they good reasons?" She said, "Yes, they were exactly the right reasons." And that was how it started. Or rather, how it announced itself, because in truth it had been starting for much longer than that, in the slow accumulated weight of months of showing up the same way every day and asking for nothing, and seeing what happened when you did that long enough. They took it slowly, deliberately and purposefully slowly. They moved through spring and into summer at the pace of people who are not in a hurry, because they understand what they have and understand what is at stake, and are not willing to damage either. Rosie watched the whole thing with the same forensic attention she brought to everything she cared about, and she did not react to it with anything dramatic. She simply incorporated it. The way a house incorporates new furniture. It belongs there, it fits. The room is better for it. June, who was methodical and deeply fair-minded and had her father's way of taking her time before rendering a verdict, announced in June that Claire was a good person who made her father less quiet on weekends, which was the most complete endorsement she had available, and which she delivered at the kitchen table over oatmeal with the same gravity she brought to all major assessments. Gerald the dog on the Maple Street corner, was formally introduced to the family that summer when the elderly man who owned and moved to a smaller apartment and asked if anyone wanted a large, sandy, philosophical dog with good manners and a firm opinion about territory. Rosie had an answer to this question before he finished asking it. Gerald moved into the Lincoln Park house in July. He sat in the front window to watch the street. He had very strong feelings about the correct positioning of his water bowl. He was, in every meaningful sense, exactly what Rosie had always said he was. The wedding was in September, a Saturday in September, which was Harlan's favorite time of year because of the light, the specific flat golden light that comes down sideways in September and makes everything look slightly more real than usual. They had it in the backyard of Claire's Lincoln Park house, which was large enough for a moderate gathering of the actual people in their lives and nothing more. Marcy was there with her husband and her two teenagers who were politely bored by adult occasions, but were genuinely fond of both June and Rosie, and spent most of the afternoon in the corner of the yard playing some elaborate game that Rosie was running with total authority. Harlan's father came from Columbus and sat in the first row of folding chairs and cried through the whole ceremony without apology. Claire's parents drove in from western Ohio, and her mother wore a blue dress, and her father shook Harlan's hand for a long time without saying anything, which was a way that man expressed approval of anything important. There were no journalists. There was no photographer hired by a publicist. There was a college friend of Claire's who was good with a camera and who moved through the afternoon quietly and caught the things she caught. Rosie stood up during the part of the ceremony where the officiant asked if anyone had something to say, which was a traditional invitation that nobody at a wedding expects anyone to actually answer, and she said that she had something to say. She said it plainly with no preamble, and everyone in the yard went very still, because the quality of her voice had changed in the past year from something careful and conserved to something entirely open, and when Rosie spoke now she sounded exactly like who she was, which was a child who had an enormous amount to say and was making up for lost time. She said, "The dog's name is Gerald because the owner's name was Gerald, and that is what Gerald wanted, and I think that's right." She paused. She said, "My dad always slowed down for Gerald." She paused again. She said, "And now Gerald lives with us, so he doesn't have to slow down, but he still does sometimes, and I think that's the best thing about him." There was a moment of absolute quiet in that yard. Then Harlan's father laughed, and it was a laugh of a man who has not laughed that fully in a long time. And then everyone laughed, and Rosie sat back down between June and Gerald the dog with the expression of someone who has delivered a complete and accurate account of relevant facts and is satisfied with the result. June patted Rosie's arm once, briefly, which was June's version of a standing ovation. Claire, standing next to Harlan in the September afternoon, in a plain cream dress that cost far less than anything she had worn to the gala the previous year, was crying, not with the held-in, careful quality of someone trying to maintain composure in public, with the loose and complete quality of a person who has finally, after a very long time of holding on very hard, simply exhaled. She was not a billionaire in that backyard. She was not the widowed heiress, or the hunted woman at the center of the siege, or the owner of the locked door. She was a woman at a wedding on an ordinary September afternoon with her daughter and her new husband and a large philosophical dog named Gerald, and a specific and particular quality of happiness that is only available to people who have been through enough to know it when they find it. Harlan stood next to her and held her hand and felt the weight of the day the way he felt the weight of a good day, with his whole chest, without trying to name it or preserve it or make it into anything except what it was. After the ceremony, when the afternoon had started to turn toward evening and the yard was full of the warm noise of people talking and children running, and Gerald the dog conducting a thorough inspection of every folding chair, Harlan stood for a moment at the edge of the yard and looked at all of it. June and Rosie running something in the corner, deeply invested. His father talking to Claire's father in the way two men talk, when they are from the same general latitude of the country, and have found their footing with each other. Marcy carrying plates in from the kitchen with the particular efficient warmth she brought to every practical act. Claire moving through the yard the way she moved through every space she genuinely inhabited, which was with a kind of ease that was not the performance of ease, but was the actual thing, finally, after a year of its slow return. Gerald sat down next to Harlan at the edge of the yard and looked out at the gathering with his customary philosophical expression. Harlan looked at the dog. Gerald did not say anything, being a dog, but Harlan looked at him and felt the whole long thread of it, from October the year before last when Rosie had handed him a folded drawing to the window of the bus, all the way to this afternoon in this yard in September. And the thread was so clear and so specific, and so entirely itself that it required no commentary. He reached down and scratched Gerald's ear. Gerald leaned into it, briefly, then returned to his upright philosophical posture. The backyard story that the ballroom thought it had been watching was simple, and it was wrong. It was a story of the lucky, ordinary man at the right place at the right time, the fortunate bus driver, the one regular guy among all those impressive, unsuccessful men who happened to be standing at the exact location where the plot landed, the lottery win in a rented suit. That was the story the room assembled itself in the time it took a child to cross a floor and take a hand. That story was not real. The real story was this. A grieving child spent 1.5 years of her short life completely silent because every adult around her was anxiously trying to fix her. The therapists and the specialists and the tutors and the carefully selected appropriate male presences, all of them coming at her with that hovering, desperate please sweetheart energy. And she felt every ounce of it, every single minute, the way children feel everything that is being directed at them by the people responsible for their lives. And it made the silence heavier, not lighter, because on top of the grief she now had the added weight of knowing she was a problem, a complication, a source of fear and anxiety in every adult who loved her. And then every single morning before school, on an ordinary route driven by an ordinary man in an ordinary bus, something small happened. The bus slowed down. It slowed down at a specific corner where a large, sandy, philosophical dog sat watching the world go past. It slowed down every morning without fail. Not because anyone asked, not because anyone was watching, not because there was anything in it for the driver, just because there was a child on the bus who needed those extra seconds and the driver had it in his power to give them. That was it. That was the whole mechanism. A man who spent 11 years learning to see people, really see them, before the world got its hands on them. A man who saw a grieving child carrying something 3 sizes too large for her and understood, without being told, that the one thing she needed that she was not getting was the simple relief of not being a problem to someone, of just being who she was, in the silence she needed, with no expectation attached. He chose the child over the fairy tale. And in the end, the child turned out to be how he got the whole family anyway. He still drove Route 14. He drove it every morning the way he had always driven it, which was with his hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road, and his attention on whoever was climbing up those steps at each stop. He drove it not because they needed the money, though the money question had been navigated between him and Claire in a series of long and honest conversations that arrived, eventually, at a structure that made sense to both of them and preserved the things each of them needed to preserve. He drove it because 40 times a day a child climbed onto that bus carrying the specific weight of their specific morning, and most of those children had plenty of people around them who would see them, really see them, before the day was through, and some of them did not, and Harlan could not tell from the outside which was which, and so he looked at all of them the same way, which was like they were the most important person in any room they entered, because they were, because every single one of them was that. Every single one of them was a person in the first chapter of something, carrying something they could not name yet, heading toward a day that would ask things of them that they had no way to prepare for, and the one thing in his power to give them, every single morning before the great big world got its hands on them, was this, the knowledge that someone had seen them today, that someone had looked and not looked past, that someone had slowed down. That might just be the most important job there is. Now, before this story ends, there is a question. A whole room full of powerful, important people, 300 of them, the most impressive and well-positioned people in the state of Illinois, could not manage to see one ordinary man standing right in front of them. They looked straight past him to the stage and the money and each other, which is what people do when they have had enough money for long enough that they have forgotten how to look at the world through any other frame. And one child, who had not spoken in 18 months, crossed that entire room past every last one of them, past every expensive gift and every performed warmth and every acquisition disguised as feeling, and walked in a straight certain line to the one person who had ever simply seen her, the one person who slowed down and asked for nothing back. Who was the person in your own life who saw you? Not who appreciated you, not who noticed you were having a good day, not who complimented you in passing. Who actually saw you, back when you felt completely invisible to everyone else in the world. The one who did not need you to be fixed or explained or okay. The one who just slowed down. Have you ever told them what it meant to you? Tell the story in the comments. The whole thing, however long it needs to be, because those stories deserve to exist somewhere they can be read. And this is a place that was built for exactly that. And if this story got to you tonight, if it reached the part of you that knows that the realest and rarest thing one person can ever do for another is simply to see them and ask for nothing in return, then do one small thing. Hit the subscribe button if you have not yet done it. Drop a like so the next person can find their way here. Leave your story in the comments and come back for the next one. Trust me, it is a good one.